you'll probably hear this from me a lot, but some sermons, are like dessert. They're wonderful and they're sweet and we enjoy them, and they're probably the ones when people say, "What was your favorite sermon?" They'll probably come up with a dessert sermon. And then Christmas Eve, what do? You tell the story of Jesus. It's a dessert sermon. What do you do on Easter? You tell the story of Jesus' resurrection. And those are dessert sermons because they're all the sweet, wonderful things of the gospel. And then there are things that are difficult, and I always look at that, I call those the tough roast beef sermons. Where you're going to get it and it'll nourish you, but you got to chew on it a while. And then there are sermons that are like the vegetables. They're nobody's favorite part, but they're good for you. So I would say we're somewhere, rather than dessert, I'd say that today is somewhere between the roast beef and the vegetables, okay? So a lot of information, a lot of historical information in the sermon, a lot of biblical studies information that's good for you, but I'll just be honest, it's not always the most fun for people who aren't students of the Bible, okay? So the first thing you need to know is that Jesus is talking in this particular passage about the laws of God and about the Torah. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Torah is the ancient Jewish law book. It's the first 5 books of your Christian Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those 5 books, just those 5 books, are called the Torah. And in Jewish faith and Jesus' faith during his day, the first thing you need to know about those first 5 books is that they are legal books. And which means that if you were an ancient Jew and you walked into a lawyer's office all the way back there in history, those 5 books would be one of the many sets of books that were on his shelf, right? That's their constitution, literally. It's their legal system. And what happened to it, that since this legal system was given to them by God, it became kind of hyper-spiritualized in the way that we like to do. And so things like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth became about revenge, right? That's like a statement about revenge. That's what we've learned, right? We talk about it. And Jesus even has to talk about it in those terms. But let me just put it back in its original context. If you put that back in the Torah, if you take that verse from where we plucked it and we put it back, it's an entire section of personal injury law. It's part of a section that says things like, if you're working with an axe and you injure someone, you need to pay them recompense for that injury. And if you perhaps kill someone by accident, not only do you have to call for mercy, but you have to give some sort of financial recompense to that person. And it's a whole section that is literally one of those commercials that comes on late at night. If you've been injured in an accident, it's literally that. And so when it talks about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, what they are literally saying is, if you have damaged someone in some way, you need to recompense them. You need to give them something of commensurate value to try and make it right. And so isn't that an interesting thing, that when we talk about our spiritual lives, it all relates back to, and it all goes back to, a legal book, a book of laws. And what's interesting about this is that by the time Jesus comes along, just in the same way that our legal system can't come up with rules for every possible scenario, right? The ancient Jews had done the same thing. Well, the law says this, but what do we do in this situation? A really good example of this is the Vatican has all of their laws written in Latin. All of them are written in Latin. They have to be written in Latin. It's sort of an ancient church kind of thing. And what's interesting is, that's great if you're talking about an old concept, but imagine what had to happen at the Vatican when you had to figure out the Latin word for cloning, right? As time goes on and more situations come, you have to come up with new laws, new ways of understanding those laws, new ways of interpreting those laws. This is why when we have a court case of any kind, what happens when we go to the judge and our hopefully intelligent lawyer says, in Ferguson versus Smith, in the 8th Central Court of Appeals, the judge decided this. So as you see, Your Honor, there is a legal precedent for what my client wants, right? And what do? They refer back to other concepts and other ideas, right? Previous rulings by the court. And once they have that precedent set. And so in Jesus' day, what they would say is, hey, we've got the law of God, and well, Rabbi such and such, well, he used to say it and used to interpret it this way. But Rabbi Smith over there, he disagreed, so he wrote this way. And they would argue back and forth over how the law should best be interpreted. And I feel like I might have told you this before, but it's a pretty solid example, so I'm going to tell you it again. The law of God has a rule that you're not to work on the Sabbath, right? Seems pretty easy on the face of it. Don't work from sunset on Friday to sunrise to sunset on Saturday. Seems pretty simple. But the law also says you're not to mistreat animals. So what do you do if it's the Sabbath and your animal is sick? Or better yet, what if you're walking your donkey along and all of a sudden you realize, oh my goodness, it's sunset on the Sabbath and I can't work anymore, but my donkey has this big burden on it, so it's not supposed to take the burden off the donkey, but if I leave the burden on the donkey, well, goodness gracious, then he's suffering under the weight of what he's carrying, and that's cruelty to animals. So I'm in violation of two laws at the same time. So they go to the rabbis, and the rabbis start to discuss it, and then they write out their ruling. And what's fun about it is, if you ever read any of these rulings, and this was an actual case, by the way, in the ruling it starts with them saying, you should have thought about this a long time ago, and you should have prepared yourself, but since you didn't, we make this ruling. And so first they start by admonishing the person to be more thoughtful. And the next thing they said is, doing as little work as possible, remove the burden from the donkey, and take the donkey home and put him into his pen so that he is safe and cared for the night. And further, if the donkey has not yet had water, which is what you do for a donkey before night, you must continue to work and put the donkey in water. Now, whatever burden the donkey had is lost to you. If it's there in a couple days when you can come back and get it, fine. But if not, that's your punishment for breaking the Sabbath. And then they said, and then go in and observe the Shabbat, observe the Sabbath. So do you see what they were doing there? They were trying to work between the two sets of laws and actual life and how to make it all work. And the funny thing is, we love to do this kind of thing. We love to make these kind of judgments on people. Have you ever heard those stories that people say, well, I did this, and well, I ended up making this horrible mistake, and now I'm paying for it, and then, I ended up speeding, and oh, wouldn't you know, the policeman gave me a ticket, and gosh, I'm just so angry and upset about it. And then what do we do? Maybe not right there with the person, but later on we know they were speeding, so they got what they deserved. Forgetting all those moments we were speeding, and I know y'all do it. Hold on just a second, let me find a mirror. I know y'all do it, right? I honestly try not to. It makes me feel so guilty. I have an overnight sense of guilt, but I honestly try not to. But every so often, you're sitting there, you're not paying attention to the lead foot happens. It just happens, and you're like, but I, as a rule, try not to speak because it scares me. But we all do that, don't we? Or such and such says, well, my daughter's pregnant and she's not going to marry that young man, but we're having a baby in a couple months. And you may not do it to your face where you're like, well, that's wonderful news, a grandchild. And then you go home and you say, you won't believe what I heard. And then you say, well, she should have, and that mother never, and now that girl is, and we just come up with whatever we come up with, don't we? Because we know, right? We have our legal tradition to stand upon. We have all the laws of God that we can use to pound people down, don't we? They shouldn't have done that. She must not have thought that through. Oh, judgy, 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 judgy. And here Jesus is, talking about the law of God. And what does he say? Don't judge, so that you won't be judged. The same thing you deal out is what God's going to deal unto you. Here you are, looking at your neighbor and saying, look at the speck of dust in your eye. Meanwhile, you got a log in your own eye. You're completely blind to what you're doing. You never realize just how much pain and difficulty and struggle there is in people's lives. I'm going to tell you a really upsetting story for the moment. And I want you to, it's desperately off-putting. But it's also more of a conviction on the church than it is on the person who did it. So a prison chaplain was telling me the story of how he met this woman, and she was a prostitute, and she had a child, and she sold her child to a couple, sort of as an adoption, but it wasn't really an adoption. She basically sold her child to these people so that she could get drug money, and she really needed to get into rehab, but she couldn't afford it, so she just went back to the drugs. And turns out these people that she sold the child to were not worthy people to have a child, and her child ended up dying, and she's confessing all of this to the prison chaplain and telling this horrible story of woe. And he said, did you ever think at any moment that you could have gone to the church and they would have helped you get the rehab you need, helped you with the baby? Did you ever think that? She said, no. I already felt so awful about myself, I can't imagine what the church would do to me. And that's a conviction of us, isn't it? Why is it that people think when they walk through that door that we're going to use the law of God to beat them down? Why is it that people don't know that this is a place of grace and mercy? Why is it that people seem to think that the church is a place where all they're going to receive is a great big hot heaping helping of judgment? A great big hot heaping helping of you're not good enough. Newsflash, we're not good enough. We're not. We all have our logs and our planks and our splinters in our eyes we all cannot see. Does the Bible not tell us that each and every one of us is like a sheep without a shepherd? We have all wandered our own way. And Jesus, instead of looking at the people as he's giving this sermon, instead of looking at them and saying, you're a sinner, and you're a sinner, and you're a sinner, and you're a sinner, he instead offers this invitation. Ask, and you'll receive. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. Whoever seeks finds. And to everyone who knocks, the door is open. And then Jesus makes this statement. You're going to get what you need. And he tells them, your Father in heaven is good. Who among you, if your child asks for bread, you give him a rock? Who among you, if your child asks for fish, you gave him a snake instead? If you know how to be good to your children, doesn't your Father in heaven know how to be good to you? Instead of writing down and throwing condemnation on people, instead of forcing them into some tyranny of obedience, Jesus simply asks, hey, what do you need? How can I help? I think that this is a beautiful image of who God is. And I think that we're actually going to leave it here rather than preach more on it. But I want you to think of God in this way. Maybe you're out with your children or your grandchildren, and they come along and they've been in the toy department while you've been, shopping for shampoo, right? Or groceries or whatever. But they've been in the toy department, and then they come up and they're like, look, Mom, it's the new, fill in the blank, Power Ranger. It's the new, video game. Can I have it? And they look at you and they've got that look on their face and they're so excited, and you may say yes or you may say no, but think about what they were like in asking. Did they sit there and say, I will earn this by being very good? Maybe. But they feel like they can ask because they know you love them. They feel free to ask because they know you love them. Imagine if all those people out there in the world and all those people in here who are hurting, imagine if they weren't afraid to ask God, to ask God's church for what they need because they know we love them. What if they become just like the children in the grocery store, knowing my mama loves me, maybe if I ask, this will come to me. Wouldn't that be a church worth going to? Dear brothers and sisters, join with me in the hymn that you see printed on the screen in front of you in celebration of wonderful grace of Jesus.